We can get started. Very good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this webinar organized by CRADLE of NTU. CRADLE stands for Center for Research and Development in Learning. So I'm Professor Luigi Kit. I'm with CRADLE. I'll be the host of this event. Before we start, let me first invite Professor Annabelle Chan, Director of CRADLE, to welcome you and give you a quick overview of CRADLE.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen first. All right. Do you see my screen okay? Very good. Well, a very good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to CRADLE Connects Webinar. I'm Annabelle Chen, a professor in psychology. I co-direct CRADLE with Professor Luigi Kit from Learning Sciences at NIE and Professor Trevor Yu, who specializes in organizational behavior at the Nanyang Business School. It is my pleasure to provide a brief introduction to CRADLE, which stands for, let me just put forward the slide, the Center for Research and Development in Learning. We are a university research center at NTU that embraces multidisciplinary research, leveraging knowledge and methods from education, psychology, and neuroscience and technology. We believe that transformative innovation can happen at the nexus of these different fields to develop a transdisciplinary outcome for the science of learning. With this, we have the vision to empower and transform learners in higher education for lifelong learning. At CRADLE, we believe that the learning takes place at various levels. It starts from the biological learning at the individual neurophysiological level, interacting with learning in a group, up to the organizational levels, to online and the Internet of Things at the very complex systems level. We currently have 3 research trusts at CRADLE that are developed in concert to help us understand how we can enhance learning across the lifespan. The first trust focuses on the emerging transdisciplinary area of the science of learning that applies knowledge from neuroscience to inform learning and education. Our research efforts have included understanding language learning in a multilingual society to enhancing cognitive agility for lifelong learning. Our second trust stems from the long-standing research at NIE on the learning sciences, where we re-emphasized its importance in examining technology-enabled learning and learning analytics in tertiary and adult learning environments and various social contexts. Through our developments in the science of adult learning and learning sciences, we recently embarked on a third research trust focusing on the future economy and workforce learning. This direction of research leverages on the research expertise in organizational behavior and talent management that has been well established in our Nanyang Business School. It allows us to delve deeper into a novel research enabling and optimizing learning within the complex ecosystem of the workforce in light of the important outcomes needed for our future economy. I am delighted that the topic of our CRADLE Connects today on enabling digital transformations in the workforce is in the very heart of this. I look forward to learn from our expert speakers today on their perspectives on leadership and learning. I hope you will also enjoy their talks and our discussions later this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Annabelle Chan, for the introduction. So we are well on to this webinar. Yesterday was the launch of the Skills Future Month, which kicked off with a forum on business transformation and upskilling. So I guess this webinar provides a related conversation, a continued conversation, as we look at digital transformation. So digital transformation is the process of using digital technologies to create new or modify or reimagine existing business processes, culture, and customer experiences to meet changing business and market requirements. So as you know, digital SMEs as well as for individuals who are employees or even owners of their own business. Digital transformation is accelerated, especially during this COVID pandemic, when many processes have to be supported by transactions which have to be done remotely. In the individual level, we talk about, for example, hawkers having a hard time getting any customers because of the current dining-in restrictions, and there's a ground-up effort to help hawkers to go digital. Digital transformation can be looked at different levels. So we also know that there's a SUSS research project on the Digital Workplace 4.0, which looks at the individual, the team, and at organizational level with respect to digital transformation. This is a CRADLE event, so naturally we like to focus on the learning, training, and developmental aspects of digital transformation. So the necessity of digital transformations and the advent of automation and AI will create tremendous needs for continuous and ubiquitous workforce learning. So therefore, it's imperative for us to understand the process and experiences of learning amongst the adult working population. So more specifically, we can look at questions, for example, to cope with and be prepared for digital transformations. What can leaders in organizations do? What can groups do? What can individuals do? What can education and training providers do? What can universities and other training organizations do? What research can we do to gain understanding in all this? So to address some of these issues, we are honored to have two speakers who will share their perspectives with us. So as you hear each speaker, feel free to find relevance, to think of you have any comments or your questions, you can type them using the Q&A function. So we have two speakers. Let me first introduce the speaker, Sahara Sadik. So Sahara Sadiq is Assistant Director Research at the Institute of Adult Learning of the Singapore University of Social Sciences. She researches on the political economy of work, and she's deeply interested to understand how societies can best organize themselves to capitalize on the human capabilities that are in each one of us. Currently, she co-leads an international research program, Digital Futures of Work, Reimagining Jobs, Skills, Education for the Digital Age, that's dedicated to understanding the prospects for human augmentation, social inclusion, and shared prosperity in the fourth industrial revolution. Sahara holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and European Studies from the National University of Singapore, a Master's in Comparative Politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So let's invite Sahara Sadik to share with us her perspectives. Sahara, please.
Thank you very much, Prof, for this invitation. Let me share my screen. All right, so thank you for the introduction. Prof mentioned about the Digital Futures of Work Research Program, which is an international research program by Cardiff University and the Institute for Adult Learning, SUSS, to come together and bring together an international team to think about what is the future of work and learning in the fourth industrial revolution. What I'm presenting today is a slice of that work, which is a 3-year research program. And here we're presenting one slice that really focuses on the role of leadership in learning, in digital innovation, and the relationship it has with talent management. To start off, let me just share and provide perspective of what I'm going to cover today. Talent, technology, and the opportunity structure. We've always talked about it, of learning and digital skills and training from a particular perspective of what, I like to put it simply, but it's probably not the only way of looking at it, but a useful frame of thinking about it as supply side, in terms of the individual attributes, whether workers have the skills, attitude, and aptitude to learn, pick up digital skills and use them at work, as part of the learning organization, etc. Relevance, whether digital skill programs content are fit for purpose. Accessibility, whether digital skills programs are accessible to workers across the skills ecosystem. So this is one aspect of the digital innovation and learning that is always discussed, I'm actually going to bring to attention an area that we think that is under research right now. And that's really what I'm going to report on, which is actually the demand side. If we are doing a good job in terms of giving access to learners, access to programs, the good quality content of AI, machine learning, etc., at the workplace, in training programs, formal, informal learning opportunities, what do we understand or what do we know about the corporate structures for digital innovation? Are they able to basically connect with what's happening in terms of how workers are building their skills? And here I'm raising a few questions here. Involvement, like to what extent, who is trusted to be part of digital innovation is a very important component of being able to actualize the learning that you have, or to be involved in that learning in a different and dramatically different way. So that's one aspect. The other one is empowerment. To what extent do people actually have access to digital tools and experimentation distributed in the workforce? The third, purpose. What's the impact to the workforce with the digital solution? Here we've heard a lot of discussion about robots taking away jobs, but we also heard that, that every period of technology change has led to more and better jobs. So where is this headed towards? Here, this is very much within the field of learning sciences as well, because we know that a lot of us learn by doing. If we are actually part of the digital innovation process in a company, the way in which we actually will learn will be exponential. If we actually have the chance to be part of it, to be able to experiment with the tools, to have the ability to understand how that can be reconstituted in our everyday practice, and how we can then actually create value to the organization as well as to our own employability. And hence here again, why I say the demand side is an integral part of learning sciences. Here I'm going to share that this is actually not a very well-researched area in terms of the connection between what the learners want and corporate structures for digital innovation. And what I'm going to share today is basically an attempt by us to take a look at what does this mean at the national level, because that's really where the quality of discussion really needs to be as well, because we actually need to understand to what extent at the national level do we actually see corporate structures for digital innovation absorbing the kind of digital opportunities for reskilling, upgrading that we've been providing through Skills Future. Again, because this is under research, we are actually creating and starting off on a unknown base, right? We don't know to what extent corporate structures for digital innovation actually support the digital skills. So let me just share with you the method that we will use. We actually start with the business side of things, the business performance and skills survey that IAL has. And this is a very survey that actually allows us to look at the demand side of things, from the perspective of senior management in an establishment. To what extent do they actually see their workforce, and to what extent do they actually report on the outcomes from their technology innovation? The second part is basically we follow up after analyzing the data from the BPSS. We actually follow up through qualitative investigation of the companies that participated in BPSS, as well as those that did not, using semi-structured interviews and triangulation between management and employee data to basically understand the character of how digital skills are being built, utilized, and deployed in an organization. I'm going to report the findings here, and I'm going to take you through some of the conceptual problems in terms of the way in which we can reasonably capture this dynamic. But what I'm sharing with you is basically an early investigation, the results that we had. So the first slide I was sharing is basically using quantitative analysis. How do we actually understand the future of corporate innovation and where does the role of the workforce sit on it? We start with two very well-established constructs in skills utilization, which is basically skills demand discretionary effort that we have in the BPSS survey. And we then add to it a dimension around talent, which is basically manages assessment of current and future performance of the workforce. And we use that to understand and categorize the different type of enterprises in Singapore. So this was using agglomerative hierarchical clustering, using word linkage. For those not familiar with it, it's really a bottom-up clustering analysis to basically allow the data to kind of speak for itself and cluster according to how enterprises can be classified according to these dimensions. And I'm going to report the finding now. A little bit of, let me take you through. So we basically find that companies in Singapore cluster first around discretion effort. Those companies that actually give a lot of discretion to their workforce, okay, which is basically type 1 and type 3 company. So that's the first clustering. So, and that's a very important or rather interesting point of reflection when looking at these findings. First, discretion effort. You need that for digital innovation, right? You need to be able to play with digital tools because nobody really knows how AI is going to be reconstituted at work, right? And therefore, that discretion is really, really important. The interesting thing is this. We expected that to be in places where there's high skills demand, discretion effort. But from what we are finding here, hey, it's not true. This type 1 and type 2 are those associated with high skills demand. Type 1 and type 3 are those associated with high discretionary effort. Now, let me just spend a bit of time looking at type 2. What's happening there? Because this completely kind of throws a lot of our assumptions around what high skills demand is. That there are a category of firms in Singapore where there is high skills demand, and yet there's not discretionary effort is not considered high. This is basically linked to the idea here when we actually look at it was basically some, how do you put it, in terms of tension and contradictions within an organization, that you are actually hiring high skilled people, but you are regarding them very differently. Now, if you look at type 2 companies, they are actually seeing above average reporting of people adding significant value, but those considered as talent is actually low. And that means basically that this is a company that takes a narrow view of talent, quite in contrast to type 1 and type 3. They basically do not think that a lot of people have a lot of potential for the future. And now we actually want to see what does this 4 types of enterprises in Singapore, how do they actually then lead to how they think about technology and workforce, right? And when we actually did further analysis, we actually realized that in terms of technology and workforce outcomes, it's very different. Type 1 is basically what you will consider as the ideal corporate player, above average skills demand, meaning that they are basically demanding degree holders, etc. Those kind of jobs that Singaporeans want. They actually create an environment where people can exercise discretion. They actually have a generous view of their workforce contribution into their future. And this is also the company that is likely to introduce technological innovation, leading to significant changes to work processes. And this is really what we want, right? We want to know what's going to happen to our job, right? And in that company, it's unlikely to reduce workforce. It's likely to increase skills training and requirements for new recruits. And this would be what we would consider as labor augmentation. Basically, in type 1 company, the workforce will be augmented. The skills that they build will actually add value to their current practice, and they are likely to keep their jobs, right? In type 2 company, which is high skills demand, and it's really interesting, like why are they different? You know, why do they not organize themselves like type 1 companies? And I'll go on to basically share that in a while. When they actually introduce technological innovation with significant changes to processes, it's likely to reduce their workforce, but it's likely to increase skills training requirements for new recruits. It means that there's actually labor, in technical terms, what we call it as labor displacement and labor upgrading happening both at the same time. That's really, really interesting. And we actually want to see why. Why do you want to reduce your workforce and upgrade skills? Is this desirable for the economy? And we'll have that discussion when we actually look at the core data. The third type, the type 3, is unlikely to reduce workforce, because they have a generous view of their workers. But neither are they likely to increase skills training requirements for new recruits. And we think that this is really tied to basically the low skills demand that they actually originally have. And type 4 is when, when they introduce technological innovation, although it's unlikely that it leads to significant changes to work processes, but when it does, it's likely to reduce the workforce and unlikely to increase skills training requirements for new recruits. I think what we are presenting here is that there are different ways in which companies are actually using technology to reimagine their workforce. And this has very important implications for the employee or whoever who's designing learning programs, whoever who's actually designing what the way in which we need to build digital skills in the workforce should look like, that there's actually a range of different ways. Which ways will support corporate innovation activities in ways that give business outcomes, in ways that actually support the employability of the workers? This is the focus of the qualitative investigation, which I'm going to report the findings now. So comparing type 1 and type 2 here, reminding again that these two types are those with high skills demand, but they differ mainly in terms of the way they value their workforce. This seems to be in our assessment an underlooked aspect of a lot of our discussions around digital skills, upgrading, retraining, and augmentation. Now, type 1 company here that we interviewed is a chemicals engineering manufacturing company that's seeking to make a transition to agri-tech. Here by agri-tech, we mean things like digital farming, etc. Now, in this company, it has set up such that it's actually valuing people, 100% of its employees. Everyone in this company is expected to build digital skills and, more importantly, solutions to support the company's transition. And this was really interesting because when we actually went to them, everybody had a role to support the company in that particular direction. And it was basically high levels of discretion, high levels of experimentation at all levels of the workforce. And of course, this is a very high skill company in terms of the jobs that they are creating. Now, what was interesting is that they actually prefer to build talent and hire from non-traditional sources for divergent thinking. Now, this was very, very interesting that we found because we are very familiar with the discourse here that people don't have the skills. Now, such discourse do not actually take place in this company, because it's not about whether people have the skills or don't have the skills, it's build it as part of your work, right? So there's a lot of opportunities for people to actually do that in this type 1 company. In type 2 company, it's basically a technology solutions TNC. And everyone is expected to build digital skills, as you can imagine, in a technology solutions company. But a small group is trusted to build the future skills for the organization. In other words, the corporate innovation program is very much controlled by a group of people that the organization trusts and empowers, develop, and recruits to basically bring the organization forward. And this is basically very different from type 1, who tries to involve everyone, whereas type 2 gets people to build digital skills, but in terms of how future operations are actually being developed and built, is basically trusted to a group of people who is considered talent. In this case, is 15 to 20%. And the interesting thing was that when we actually was looking at the way they then built that talent pool to look at their future operations, very different from type 1 company. They actually prefer to hire from their business competitors in what has been called, well, not unfamiliar to many of us, war for talent, a revolving door and a way of then getting the best in the market and trying to keep, develop, and retain them, but a small proportion. So this is basically a different way in which company can organize themselves. What I'm presenting here is that there are different ways, and the implications that it has for employees on the ground is very different. Whether you are in a type 1 company versus whether you are type 2 really depends on whether you are actually given the chance to play with AI tools to develop those kind of solutions, etc. In type 1, everybody has a chance. In type 2, everybody has a chance to build skills, but perhaps building those future skills or the future products for the organization is trusted to a small group. So I share with you some quotes here in terms of how the talent sourcing becomes a key strategy for building digital skills. In the type 2 company of the professional services technology solution company, basically it's done through the talent future role, which can be anywhere around 15 to 20% of their workforce. And they actually invest in those people differently from the rest, right? And we need to basically recognize that this is happening in some companies. It doesn't mean that they don't build the digital skills of the rest of their workforce. They do, but they do it differently for this particular group, who then actually has access to a lot of opportunities to basically be ahead, of the curve, right? And this is their strategy, very different from type 1. In contrast, the type 1 company does the digital innovations very differently. They don't want to basically rely on a small group of people because they actually feel that there is no point in relying on a small group of people. We need a lot and more people with ideas and solutions to take us ahead. And therefore, and interestingly, or more importantly, perhaps I would like to say, is that they were very, very open to non-traditional sources of workers, be it within the company, right? Whoever who is interested will be given a chance. But also when they hire outside, they actually are looking at people with different one. They are not looking for a data scientist only, they're looking at people who might actually look at things differently, etc. So here I'm sharing here a data from an interview we did with one of the employees in the type 1 company, where basically she's basically a social worker who is converting. She feels she enjoys doing data analyst work, and she really wants to basically build herself in that way. She went onto a professional conversion program sponsored by WSG, and she went through the courses, etc., went to the labor market, and then she got stuck. She's 50 years old, don't have the credentials of being a data scientist, a data analyst, no working experience, and she just felt that it was really no reply. Wherever she goes, etc., send the resumes, etc., she just didn't have a reply. And she was really shocked when she was granted an interview with this company. And when the hiring manager actually told her, and I quote from here, "I'm looking forward to you joining because I know you are mature. You'll be able to step back and take a more holistic look at things." Basically, this is the source of innovation for this particular company, divergence. They actually want people who think differently, and they want them to be across the organization, bringing diverse perspectives. And it's through that spirit of collaboration in a diverse workforce that they actually see innovations coming out. I just want to spend a bit of time talking about type 3 and type 4. And this is really important because when we actually speak to the employees and the companies, even when they actually have low skills demand, etc., so to speak, we actually saw a lot of playing around with digital tools already. The talk about AI, etc., even among our SMEs, is very much more advanced than we would like to, than we thought we would see. And the way in which that actually impacts on the workforce would be really quite very, very interesting to see, because, everyone talks about it as though that's really what a lot of the big companies would do. But here we're observing that even the small companies are having very advanced thinking around what they can actually do with AI for their business. Here I'm sharing, again, type 3 and type 4, reminder that type 3, both of them are actually what we say low skills demand. Again, this is based on averages. Doesn't mean that they really have low skill demand. Generally, we actually a very high skill demand economy. It's just that relative to the type 1 and type 2, they actually have low skill demand. minimum is a diploma holder to work in these two companies, or rather, usually the expectation is a diploma holder, but of course they also take ITE grads and those with lower formal qualifications. The main thing about this company is that Type 3 has a generous view of the people. They actually prefer to build up people. Type 4, the proportion value is small. And that actually has implications in terms of how they actually use digital tools. All staff have opportunity to build digital skills in both companies. And in fact, I will say in all 4 types, everybody has the chance to build digital skills. But the objective for digital skills in this Type 3 and Type 4 company is very, very different. And this is really interesting because we are actually seeing how practices are reconstituted. In Type 3 company, digital solutions are seen as making staff more efficient because remember, they are really valuing their employees and saying that this is a group of people to be built and retained. And therefore, they want to make sure that the core advisory practice in this particular company, which is basically giving advice to clients on what kind of insurance they should take, is preserved. They are avoiding platformizing, for instance, because they actually say platformizing is when you actually allow the machine to give those advice, and they don't want that because that will impact quality. That's what they say, right? So they are avoiding that. They are trying to reconstitute and giving their staff space to look at how chatbots can augment the practice and the advisory. In contrast to Type 3, Type 4, again, travel industry, also providing advice, in this case, itinerary. And the main thing is that a small team is entrusted for future operations. Think about the travel business and how we can build chatbots and AI itinerary system, AI-powered itinerary system for the company, etc. Similar to Type 2, a small team is entrusted to do it. Now, the way in which it's then talked about is very different. Digital solutions to require fewer workers. They're actually looking at automation, really, or labor substitution. Staff follows up on AI solutions, very different from Type 3 company, because basically the staff is then having to reconstitute its practice in relation to what the AI is throwing up, right? And the staff is expected to call up clients after the client has been given an AI-powered itinerary recommender system. So this is then a way in which we actually say that perhaps how practice is reconstituted is not just based on how the companies are set up, based on how workers actually have agency to think and learn, but also how that relationship is shaped by whether companies actually value and trust their workers. It seems so simple, right? But perhaps that's what it is. Why do I have this much meetings? Okay, anyway. Comparing Type 3 and Type 4 company, the divergent AI approaches that I've been highlighting. Let me just say some quotes from the CEO in the Type 3 insurance company. As he's speaking on the future of his operations, he wants to be known for the quality of his company's advice. So his strategy is for digital. He'll be looking at internal processes to be as digital as possible, be efficient, but the advisory, he's going to preserve that. And he wants it to be managed. And he wants his staff to use AI tools to support them in doing good advisory. So the core practice is preserved. In contrast, for the HR manager, now this is really interesting because before this conversation that I actually am reporting here, she was talking about the importance of having industry experience in terms of them being able to advise clients appropriately, etc. But when we actually talks about technology, it's a completely different conversation. She basically then suddenly, the appreciation of the industry experience is zoomed out, I would say, right? So if a customer wants, and I quote here, let's say in the future, they want us to propose itineraries, then the AI can recommend the itinerary for them. It may be that some positions disappear, but of course we will need the human touch. Perhaps staff will have to come back and do a follow-up personal call after the initial AI touch. So this is then a different way in which AI is being used in reconstituting practice. And here again, she's talking about the future operations. This is still underway, but she's already have sent staff for digital operations training, but right now she's actually not using them for any reimagining of the operations. Like I said, that's actually relied upon on a very small group. Quite in contrast to the CEO in the Type 3 insurance company, he's involving everyone to be using those tools and thinking about how to do it well. And he's basically also highlighting the value of the older and the younger generation. And maybe I could just add on to this. He basically talks about the value of the strategic thinking that the older generation has in his company and the technological savvy younger workers, and bringing it together. So really a very much built model for AI that the CEO is thinking about in the Type 3 company versus the buy model that the HR manager is talking about in Type 2, this should be a Type 4 company. Type 4 company in which basically she is thinking that the AI solutions would be outsourced in terms of being developed. Very different. Now, why should all this matter, right? These are all very different ways in which companies are actually playing around with AI tools, thinking about how to reimagine the future operations, the future of work for within the company. Why should it matter? And I share with you, this is why it matters. 2 reasons. The company that reported the best financial performance is based on our BPSS analysis is the Type 1 company, the one that actually give a lot of freedom and flexibility to their staff. Such companies report the highest increase in profitability, highest increase in revenue, highest increase in market share. So that's from the business perspective. Interesting thing is that this is also the company that reported the highest attrition rate. Now, this can be seen as, oh my God, this is a terrible company. No, no, no. When we actually interview the employees, everyone loves being in that company. Now, the highest attrition rate is actually related to labor market power because everybody actually has a chance to build their digital skills as part of their everyday work, and therefore the way in which their resume actually looks as part of their experience in the company makes them very marketable. In other words, being part of a Type 1 company adds value to you as an employee across the broad proportion of the workforce, hence the reporting of the highest attrition rate. Usually in Type 2 companies, the highest attrition rate is observed at the top end of the labor market, meaning people who are actually developed as talent. Because obviously when you are developed as talent, you get those kind of opportunities, you actually get to build a resume, but not so for the rest of the workforce. But in this Type 1 company, it's built across, and therefore it makes sense for them to report the highest attrition rate. Now, is that a problem from a company perspective when we actually discuss with them? No. Why? Because they always see everybody as talent. So it doesn't matter if people live good, if it's a good fit for them, if they actually find something else, I'll find somebody else and bring them into the organization because everyone is talent. I wouldn't have a problem, right? So they already have created those structures for bringing people in, for giving people discretion, for organizing people to basically be able to exercise discretion and autonomy in building their own skills in everyday work. So I just want to summarize by saying that who in the workforce gets a chance to make successful digital transition is as much shaped by the access to digital skills training, development, etc., as it is shaped by corporate structures of digital innovation. And we want to know that we must acknowledge that there are different ways in which companies can organize the workforce for digital innovation. But there are some that may actually be less empowering, may be less engaging, and some that is really at the core of what the company's transformation is for the broad proportion of the workforce. Firms that take a generous view of their workforce will engage and empower their workforce differently through the involvement of everyone and looking at how those solutions augment their everyday practice. So kind of reconstitution of everyday practice using digital tools. we know that digital transformation requires new ideas and fresh ways of doing things while capitalizing on existing strengths. Therefore, firms that take a narrow view of their talent might be at risk of blind spots. So we've heard from type 2 company, basically they're saying that we want fresh ideas, etc. But they keep on relying on a small group of people. And we want to do things differently. And it's also, they want to do things differently, but they don't want to look at sources of recruitment differently. And we'd say that just kind of holds. And that's also why type 1 companies are performing much better from the financial perspective. So we ask whether to what extent are leaders open and trusting of non-traditional approaches for leveraging their workforce, and that perhaps success in digital transformation of the workforce might actually require leaders to first disrupt any thinking that good ideas will come from a select privileged group. But more importantly, the character of opportunities that the workforce or workers can actually be used and capitalized by the company to reimagine their future operations is better served if they are able to create those structures that can harness from non-traditional sources. Not saying that don't go to those places that people normally go for, but to be open to that. There are other ways of doing it. There are other sources of it, and that might be the source of innovation. That's what I like to end with. This is the Digital Futures of Work website. Please visit us. We'll be putting up a lot of working papers, policy papers, practitioner notes onto the website to basically share with the community, locally and internationally, the work coming up from the program. Just to highlight also from this research, taking it forward, we'll be looking at studying this further in the next iteration of BPSS, the Business Performance and Skills Survey that's currently underway. We are also looking at how do we understand this in other countries? Do other countries have also different ways in which the corporate sector is organizing themselves for innovation and the implications it has for the workforce? So we will be looking at countries like China, Finland, Germany, and looking at Vietnam as well, looking at both the Asian and European and US, of course, and seeing at how this is being organized in the respective national settings. So I hope you'll be interested, and please connect with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sahara, for sharing with us a slice of the findings from your research project. So a very interesting framework on the corporate structure, on how organizations cope with digital transformation, how they manage the talent and employees in terms of two dimensions, the discretion and the demand. So a number of very good questions have come through, but may I suggest we hold the questions back. We have the second speaker come on, and then we have both speakers respond to the questions. So thank you very much, Sahara. Let me now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Jennifer Tan. Dr. Tan is the Vice President of Learning and Development at OCBC. She heads the Learning Technology, Data and Design team at OCBC campus. So together with a fellow group HR and business counterparts across the OCBC group, she designs and drives technology-enhanced learning innovations to enable future capability, build, promote learning agility, and foster a thriving learning organization for sustainable growth. Dr. Tan has held various academic and educational roles, including the Assistant Dean for Learning Analytics and Knowledge Mobilization at the National Institute of Education, Singapore, a research fellow at ARC Centre of Excellence in Creative Industries and Innovation, Queensland University of Technology, Australia, and Global Research Manager on Program Impact at the International Baccalaureate Organization. So Dr. Tan is passionate about leveraging technology affordances to provide learners, young and less young alike, with both relevant and meaningful transformative learning experiences and life outcomes. She holds multiple degrees in philosophy, education, business information systems and accountancy. So let's invite Dr. Jennifer Tan. Maybe Jennifer, you'd like to respond to saying whether OCBC is type 1 or type 2 or type 3 or type 4.
Exactly. I asked, in the Q&A, thank you so much, Sahara. Thank you, Prof. Louis, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Sahara, for a very interesting and in-depth sharing of research. And, I have two questions. One is, are we type 1 or type 2, 3, 4, 5? I don't know. There may be many. One of my questions in the chat is, are organizations necessarily so discretely organized into these types that you shared, or are they more hybrid in nature? I think Sunju also, I saw on the Q&A some insights there and responses there. And after my sharing, perhaps we can, I look forward to a very rich conversation. The other question I had was, we were talking about demand side, right? And Sahara framed her sharing that she's sharing from the demand side. And Prof. Louis and I were earlier talking, then is my sharing from one organization. Everyone is welcome to typologize us as I share, okay? And are we, and probably suggested that I'm coming from a supply side. In some way, it is true. Again, I think the categories of demand and supply, right? And are we then supply and demand? I think this is, there are many layers to it. There are really many layers. So depending on which view you're taking, from an overarching national view that Sahara is taking, we are demand, right? Because we are one firm, and that's what you're saying. We're from the demand side, we're a firm. However, in a firm, there's so many layers, right? Within a firm, leadership, operations, how we structure it, strategy, all right down to the heart, which is people, right? And people, when you look at it from an organizational lens, then you can see, hey, we are supply and the employees are demand. So I think these binary formulations would be something that I would be challenging or inviting us to challenge our own framing in the last section here where I talk about leveraging polarities. So I'd like to share with you some macro shifts impacting us as one organization, how we design, how we respond to these macro shifts, and one of our strategic imperatives being actively designing a learning organization. We wouldn't say we are quite there yet. It is an ongoing journey, as all educators and people working in industry and policymakers definitely know very clearly. And last but not least, I'd like to suggest some tensions and polarities for our collective discussion. I start with this, Future Trends 2030. I'm sharing some of these futures cards that have been developed by Human Capital Leadership Institute in concert with the Center for Strategic Futures. I wouldn't give a lecture on every of these futures. There are 20 futures cards that they posited, right? And there are many other futures-oriented organizations in the world. But as I put this here, I think many of you can already resonate, right, with many of these future trends that are extremely powerful and current and pressurizing. They represent new pressures, new risks for our historical moment in time right now. Particularly important to us is the worker be redefined. Being OCBC Bank, being a national employer, we take a very serious, and committed stance towards empowering our workforce, not only for the individual, not only for the bank, but really for the nation state as well. And ultimately, the nation state as Singapore sits within the global economy. We truly believe in empowering workforce for mobility flows, talent flows across, geographical divides, if you will, and global economies. So the worker be redefined, especially with COVID, with new technologies. I wouldn't have to labor the point. Part of the new technologies, we talk about new algorithmic risks, new data tapestries. As you see there are geopolitical pressures that are facing us all the time. And there are deep changes, right, to knowledge as we know of it. And all the educators and scientists and, here looking at knowledge across all domains, I'm sure, gathered here today will very much be grappling daily with how knowledge in your domain has shifted and how important, therefore, learning and redesigning learning is critical to all of us. There are some others. I won't, lay out all of the 20 futures cards here, but these are some others about Asia-centrism. So within a political economy, the rise of Asia, chrysalis and longevity, unbound and longevity society. I'd like to harken back to Sahara's talk later. Demographics, locally and nationally and globally, are extremely important kind of trajectories that we have to attend to, particularly in the line of sustainable futures, right? In many different aspects of the world. And here, as we talk about all of this, it's not all positive and rosy, because within these pressures, there are new risks, there are growing inequalities, and the nature of how we work together, as societal counterparts, right? As part of a much larger ecosystem way beyond ourselves. How do we organize ourselves? How do we move from competing to collaboration? And we have used this term for at least 5 decades, collaboration being a critical core skill, right? But we have found in practice that true collaboration is not quite as easy as we all desire, if you will. Now, looking into the financial and banking sector, I note in the Q&A, Sunju had some very key insights into sectoral diversity and unique pressures. In light or situated within these global futures trends are very more macro, micro pressures and risks facing the financial and banking sector. In Singapore, we have all heard in earlier this year, the new releases of new digital bank licenses, right? And how can a bank, which is relatively known as a more conventional traditional bank, right? They will call us, as compared to the new digibanks. How do we respond to these challenges? Where are our anchor points? Where are our pillars? Where are our value adds to our customers, to the general population? And can we make ourselves distinct? The pressures are coming fast and fierce. To this end, one response, right, from I'll first share one response of our bank, but first I'll share about how then in the larger domain of organizational literature and human capital literature, there is a strong push for and a call for designing a transformative learning organization as one key strategic imperative for organizations. Here you see Josh Bersin, a renowned human capital thought leader, talking about how learning culture is perhaps the most important asset any company can build. And he posits that learning is worth the investment, and the numbers back it up. So what are some numbers, right? What are some numbers here? Talent is very much the new oil. A stronger learning organization based on research. The sources are at the bottom, ranging from World Economic Forum to independent employer branding studies across that are global studies, regional studies, and local studies. There is evidence that strong learning organizations reap 3 times higher motivation, as you can see there. Retention, talent is the new oil, so talent retention and productivity, right? Leading to at least 3 times innovation, profitability, and sustainability for the organization, and 4 times more change responsiveness, all right? Culture is the new paycheck to our employees and our workforce, our individuals, particularly the chrysalis generation, yeah? More than 77 adults, this is global as well as local, regional and local. More than 77% of adults, in a survey conducted across widely in Europe, considers company culture before applying for a job. I'd like us to reflect whether we do the same, even though we're not the chrysalis generation. How important is company culture? It is now extremely important to our chrysalis generation. More than 50% of them consider company culture as having more impact than job satisfaction, than salary does, right? On job satisfaction than salary does. It definitely holds true for me. I'm not sure about you, all right? And maybe you can ping me in the chat whether company culture or salary matters more to you in terms of job satisfaction. Bringing it closer to our region and our home. We have a home meaning Singapore. There are 3,000, more than 3,000 talents, in China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. They consistently rank, this is a very recent study in Q1 2021, that learning culture is a top strength that attracts them to any company, all right? So in OCBC Bank, you hear our new first woman CEO, Helen Wong, mentioning that her statement is very much people are our most important asset, right, here at OCBC. And you will have every opportunity to learn, progress, and succeed. So I think in terms of typology, Sahara, where would you categorize us?
Let me think about it. I'll let you know.
Yes, truly a scholar. Yes, I think from a CEO statement and one of the quotes inside the Q&A is, or the questions in the Q&A is it purely leadership? There are many layers in an organization, but at least from a positioning, from a senior leader within the bank, the chief of a bank, of our bank, people are our most important asset. And every opportunity to learn, progress, and succeed, we will avail. We have a tagline, no person left behind, all right, in any transformation move. How then do we build or forge this learning organization? It is not created by chance. We firmly believe that it is by design. How do we design then? Our mission statement is at OCBC campus, an important part of OCBC Bank, is then to design for a true learning organization to foster lifelong learners through science-informed practice. At this point, our SSG colleagues, do you classify us as type 1 or type 2? I should stop making jokes, but we're very aligned with the mastery and lifelong learning, I think, impact statement, if you will, of our nation state, because we firmly believe that people really are at the heart of any organization, any nation state, and beyond, right? And science-informed practice is very important to us. Often there is a divide, and I would suggest that it's not, it is a false divide that we as a collective need to work hard to tear down, is that there's often a divide between practice and science, right, or research. And it's an ongoing journey because there are two very, very strong domains with very clear agendas that might be fundamentally different. For instance, a bank, any corporation is fundamentally a commercial enterprise. In any commercial enterprise, there are always tensions between a developmental, humanistic call to action. So how do we bring those two together? Or science, naturally, deep science, has a much longer trajectory to value. All right, whereas a commercial enterprise, particularly those that are listed in public that have shareholders, investments, they are tied to a different set of accountability, of stewardship, of answering to investors and shareholders as part of public trust and confidence, right? So there are competing tensions, but for us at OCBC Bank, we are very committed to pulling together practice as well as science. And we see people at the heart of our learning organization, informed by the learning sciences, are peeling out into the organization. People are situated and perform and behave within organizational structures which are need to be informed by management sciences in all that we do, right? And clearly our organization sits within a sector and an ecosystem that is much larger than ourselves, and system sciences become increasingly important for us in order to plot our course forward. When we set out our learning organization framework that is science-informed, we are also very clear and very aware that it needs to be ground up. It needs to be ground up, and it needs to hear and take into account the considerations, the collective wisdom, the experiences, needs, gaps, aspirations of our people across the group, not only at the top tier leadership level, but definitely right across the bank, from new joiners, new talents, new graduates, into the middle tier of employment and leadership and management, right up to the tier of the strategic leadership, right? So we believe in, we embarked on a piece of work over the last 1.5, 2 years to develop a learning blueprint that is by the people, for the people. And this blueprint is intended to evolve over time, right? So we don't stop. We want to refresh it with new experiences, new voices, new needs, gaps, and aspirations. From this learning blueprint, which we worked with external partners, in the sector, but also beyond, a range of multidisciplinary, we engage multidisciplinary stakeholders within and external to the bank to enrich our work in developing our learning blueprint. We can distill it into 2 primary levers in terms of forging a strong learning organization moving forward. On 2 axes, one is opportunity, one is motivation. All right, and here we find that I'm going to share with you next 8 archetypal learner personas that we see across these 2 levers, if you will. So flowing up, right, and down are the opportunity disparity gaps. All right, so on the top bar, what you will see are people with high opportunities, or a sense of felt opportunities, if you will. All right. The bottom bar are people who have low opportunities or speak of themselves as having low opportunities. Left to right, what you will see is the differentiation and the variation from low motivation to high motivation. We have these 8 learner personas within our bank across 30,000 employees group-wide, right? Now, my question would then be, do you think you fall into any particular discrete category of a persona? And if so, which one? Then the next question that many organizations or learning interventionists might ask, learning designers might ask is, should I invest in moving people up the opportunity scale, or should I invest in people moving right to the motivation scale? Should I do more interventions and invest a little bit more in the conflicted and move them up to inspired because that's an easier journey? Or do I really, go and look at who are the resigned and how do I move them up to the inspired, right? Or at least to the responsive. Okay, all right. Typologizing our learner personas, when we go and when we share this among our internal and external stakeholders, we always make it a point to be very clear that these learner personas are porous in nature, meaning a single unique individual do not fall within do not hold only one persona. Personas are deeply situated in context, right? So I could be reluctant in one context and inspired in another, potentially, or I could be a combination of reluctant, constrained, and conflicted. All right, so we want to show that it is porous to some extent, even though there may be a dominant persona that one holds. We do this persona profiling, if you will, not intended for very, not with the aim of stereotyping or having any summative high stakes impact on an individual's mobility or trajectory or future within the bank. In fact, we do that so that we have a clearer view of where are opportunity gap disparities. All right, and we hold a very, this is our view of how we would like to push opportunities for all, or how we design for opportunities for all. We are very mindful that often when people talk about opportunities, they talk about opportunities in terms of purely equal treatment. Our sociologists and policymakers here would be more than aware that providing equal treatment, all right, is not quite sufficient. It's important, but insufficient condition, not sufficient condition for equity. And we are very, and this is where I think, Sahara, the layers come in. Because in our bank, there are 18 divisions, and you take 18 times at least 5 to 7 departments within the bank, and times at least 7 grades across the bank. there are very unique differentiations of the opportunities or resources that different employees get. For instance, our front desk or our front-facing sales staff that are tied in contact centers, for example, in branches, for example, they have a very different, setting of work as compared to the back office folks like us who are doing, very different, right? Who have relatively more flexibility in our time. Resources, very different. In a bank, earlier I talked about cyber risk, cyber and information risk. Security of data is absolutely crucial and critical, right? We are not the financial sector is not the only, sector that faces this challenge, right? And high security then has implications on access to devices, right? Access to cloud-based resources. So if we have Campus on Cloud, which is a cloud-based learning management system, and we have a lot of virtual webinars like this, we do have a small fraction of our colleagues in particular roles that are of high data exposure risk who are constrained. Right? They may not have, they can only work on devices and on-site networks that are highly protected. They are on desktops that have no videos. And so these are all constraints that when you drill down and take a magnifying glass, you can really see the differences beyond. One of the things that we really want to, we are always mindful of is that providing equal treatment and equitable treatment, which is customized support and resources, is not yet enough. How can we, at structural levels, at policy, at processes, remove systemic barriers for our range of stakeholders, being our employees that we serve? That's the opportunity lens that we hold, and we are constantly having that in mind when we design our learning initiatives, engagements, programs, movements across the bank. The other is the lever of motivation. And with motivation, underpinning our OCBC learning blueprint philosophy is autonomy, mastery, and relatedness. For mastery, we call it Better Me, Better Us, that talks about value creation for ourselves as well as for our people over time, right? Over time. And here you see autonomy and relatedness. For those that are very familiar with the self-determination theory, I would not have to elaborate this further, but autonomy refers to agency, a sense of having choice, having control, having responsibility. Mastery, over time, competency-based growth. Having growth mindsets, productive failure mindsets, and learning power is particularly important. And in relatedness, we very much like to design or hearken ourselves or guide ourselves as a beacon call that how can we leverage relatedness, which has one of the highest impact in public education in that we know in primary to secondary at the very least. Teacher-student relatedness accounts for 30%, right, of the 0.3 effect size, one of the highest effect size. How do we bring that? Line managers, right, are particularly important in terms of, and the relatedness with the employee and the team member, particularly important in driving intrinsic motivation for learning. I would unpack one example of a program here, and then I would open it up and then share a range. Mentor Me, for example, is our mentorship program that has been running for the past 4 years for women at OCBC in particular, right? It's a 9-month structured program, as you can see it, with a strategic focus on young women within the bank, right? Being mentored by our senior executives. On this note, all right, the design elements are mentors by choice, mentees by choice, matching by preference, all right? And it's multimodality in nature. Okay, very much so. If you have questions, any specific questions on how this is, we really wanted, this Mentor Me program was very much an evolution over time. And right now, I think for instance, our number of mentors and mentees almost double every year by voluntary, discretionary effort, borrowing Sahara's words in her presentation, all right? They're not paid more, okay, but a discretionary effort to make a difference, leave a mark in someone else's life within the bank, in a colleague's life within the bank. We have many others. Explore is a gig-based within the bank all right? Short-term, 3 months, gigs are posted, and we try to have a gig marketplace within the bank so that there's talent mobility and cross-multidisciplinary learning. All right, we have Campus Goes Virtual, which was really brought in post-COVID. We were doing a 50-50 split of face-to-face and online learning. And last year we saw an 80-20, right? And now it's tapering off at about 60% virtual and 40% face-to-face. We have our campus stars, we celebrate them. People who are, we have about 500 campus stars now who are really learning champions. They teach out of discretionary effort above and beyond their business as usual. Right? And we have our women's suite for our senior executives. And of course, we have a campus collective. What we want to highlight is many of these programs are organized across group, and we have multiple regional presence and international branches across the globe. So last 2 slides, I think that we're quite concerned about time. I have 2 slides more. I'd just like to share 5 key tensions, right, that we experience along this journey. These are the key tensions that are really felt on the ground. Firstly, any organization would very much be faced with, enterprise or ecosystem. It's a very real tension, and both have their benefits and their risks. For OCBC, we are more enterprise by legacy. How do we then move gradually to cloud? How do we then gradually move to open source? Right? And how do we do that in a way that attends to risk responsibly? All right. Efficiency versus effectiveness is pervasive. How do we get standardization for a big organization, right? Catering, as I said earlier, to diverse variation of employees as well as stakeholders, right? But how do we have some form of standardization yet achieve customization and hyper-personalization? For instance, Singapore is always the biggest part of the whole bank in the group. Okay, there are very real challenges, how you customize and yet how you standardize. I'm sure this is felt within all the big, policy-making institutions and ministries as well, and universities where we have participants today. Procedural or relational? This is the point that I mentioned earlier about collaboration. Organizations are organized technically, functionally, domain experts, right? But what this does is naturally it's set up for certain siloistic agendas and performance, and that drives high performance too. But how do you more and more problems and challenges are multidisciplinary in nature with no straight answers? How do we connect and drive cognitive diversity, coming together as a collectivist, sort of set up autonomous teams to solve big, hairy problems? That's very much a challenge. I mentioned earlier that we want to drive intrinsic motivation that is premised on self-determination, autonomy, agency, and motivation, but this stands against or in direct tension to compliance. In banks, in high security, high risk sectors, compliance is extremely important. And as I mentioned earlier, commercial enterprise performance, very important. It's responsible stewardship. How then do we look at this and hold this at the same time as holding a developmental approach, right? That's empathetic in nature, that accounts for different prior learning, prior abilities, right? And then future pathways. There will always be tensions. Okay, but how do we leverage these tensions is our big question. We do not have the answer, but we constantly navigate this every day, and we constantly challenge ourselves to not think in terms of binary formulations of either or, and not be reactive to tensions and negative to tensions, but see them productively and creatively towards a both-end logic. How do we leverage polarities, right? Very important, add-on versus edit-down model. In any transformation journey, learning or organization and business, there's a tendency to add on without, kind of thinking, what actually can we lose? This is a very real thing. Do we compound pressure or do we spark joy, quoting the words of Marie Kondo? All right. And last but not least, I think in any transformation, it's very easy to transform in appearance. Okay. It's a little bit more difficult to transform in the form of the operating model. But what we really want to drive towards and what is needed right now for any organization is a deep transformation in terms of our nature. What is our strategic essence? our purpose, our impact. Who are we and why? And with this, I close with our impact statement. We designed for a true learning organization at OCBC campus to foster lifelong learners through science-informed practices. We are committed to building a group of agile employees who can learn, unlearn, and relearn. Learning is prioritized for us, but we are very certain that we cannot journey on this alone. So I'm very grateful for CRADLE for inviting us to come here and connect with all of you. And we would like to give an open invitation to anyone who wants to partner us from academia to policymakers to come. There are many opportunities to collaborate to help us drive a transformative learning organization such that we can be a beacon, not only in Singapore, but also for Asia. And and in the global economy as a whole, not only as a bank, but as an important part of our community and our global economy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for speaking from the industry perspective, providing us very deep insights about what it means to be a transformative learning organization using the experience of OCBC, and you provide very clear description of the practices and clear practices as practiced by OCBC. Thank you, Jennifer. So we come to the discussion section of this webinar. Okay, so let's look at the questions that have been posted in Q&A. I'll just run through the questions. I think Sahara has very nicely responded, typing answers, but I'd like to invite Sahara to sort of voice out the answers so that it can benefit all. So there's a question on the typology of the skills discussion, which Jennifer also raised. So is it influenced by the unique sectorial logics, or is it due merely to the leadership kind of culture? So Sahara, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for all the questions. And Jen, I don't know how to answer you. Is OCBC which type of it? Okay. Well, I just want to say that basically what we found was that essentially, in terms of how companies are organized, there's actually no sectoral bias that in terms of companies that take a generous view of their workforce versus those that don't. We do know that it will look different based on the sector. But in the fintech sector, we have found companies that were, or rather in financial industry, we have found companies that is more type 2 than type 1, for instance. And we have found also companies that were obviously type 1, So it really varies. We have found, so basically whether you are a type 1 or type 2, in terms of sectoral logic, it makes more sense whether you are actually type 1, type 2 versus type 3, type 4, because it's basically about the skills demand. So, that's but how you organize within the company is really not dependent on that. We found something that was really interesting though. How it was depending was whether relative to your competitors, were you customizing? If you were customizing, you are likely to be a type 1 or type 3. And why? Because of the very nature that when you are customizing your products and services all the time, you actually need every workers to exercise discretion, simply because it's not standardized products and services. So everybody has to learn, has to basically customize it for their clients. So whether it is a type 1 or type 3 company, we found that to be really an important marker of discretion.
Yeah.
So Jen, to respond to you,
I think I'd love to hear from other participants too, but I think I personally find I respect the work, and I think aligned with what the research is showing and the typologies in nature. I would just urge that in typologizing needs to be done in a very nuanced way. And it's very hard. I'm hard pressed every day in corporate sector to say simplify, right? What's this nuance? It's just nuance. you know, and what exactly, you know, is it? Where do we fit? What's next? You know, these are important questions. But I think that's where I talked about the tension between action and science, right? Investigation, advocacy, and inquiry. I think how do we design for that sweet spot is extremely important in anything that we do. And I would also, one reaction, if you don't mind, that I would have is I am rather uncomfortable with the use of, you know, kind of, you used everybody a lot, right? Everyone, like the hyperboles are very difficult in a very big organization. I think policymakers would experience that as well. Ministries would experience that as well. It's easy as a statement, but to achieve the goal of everybody being in one way or another, displaying discretionary effort, is almost an impossible target and metric. And without a clear target or metric, it would be very difficult to plot a chart or a course forward. It's just my humble considerations.
I would like to respond to that, Chike, if you don't mind, really, because that is something that has been discussed in many presentations that I have. And to what extent can this actually really be possible, everybody? And that is really why looking at alternative practices can really actually shape new ways in which we can drive change in our organizations. Because as Jen, you rightly pointed out, organizations tend to be bureaucratic, etc. But there are actually evidence of companies organizing themselves really differently. And I'm not talking
about— I didn't say that, by the way. I didn't say that organizations are bureaucratic in nature.
Oh, yeah, you know, you did. Okay, I'm sorry if you did. Yeah.
No, I didn't.
Yeah. But,
yes, I hear you. I think, pardon me.
But, you know, it is always easy to say it's difficult. But we have found type 1 companies that are large, that take that as their basic approach and then work within that, meaning that the basic approach is everyone is valued, everyone is given discretionary effort, and everyone is expected to exercise discretionary effort. And that they find it to be difficult because many people are actually not used to exercising discretionary effort. You mean I actually have a chance to decide? You know, so that is what type 1 firms actually face in Singapore. That when you actually give people discretion, they may not be ready to take it up. So I think the value of the research that we did was basically to really find that there is a different type of firms, big and small, who have decided to organize themselves differently. And in fact, I've been following this internationally as well. And there are actually companies who said, no, we don't need HR department in the way that is done. Because if managers don't know their workers, oh my God, they're not doing things right. So, you know, so there are divergent approaches. And we actually saw, and this was really interesting, that companies actually can shift. It was more dynamic than we thought it was. We actually, because this survey was done in 2016 and we interviewed them in 2021. So some of the things in which, why companies shift, say from type 2 to type 1 or type 4 to type 3 is, and vice versa, is because, hence very nicely, leadership change. You know, there is a change in leadership at the highest level and they decided this is where they want to be moving forward. The other way around usually is because of mergers and acquisitions. So again, is organizational change, but moving it in the other way around, where then they become more, you know, bureaucratic, etc. So we were quite struck by how dynamic organizations really are, and how they are themselves trying to shift. How they are shifting and where it is when you actually analyze it is pretty discrete, but the journeys are not, right?
So yeah, I suppose Sahara, as you proceed the research, right, you map all the data points now currently from Singapore, and you're going to broaden it internationally. Yeah, you see how does it relate to the questions, you know, whether the sectorial differences matter. Yeah, so let's move on to the second question. Does high skills demand in the study means that job that require degree holders? So that's a question of the definition of high skills. Yeah, from Sunju.
Yeah. Okay. So this is basically a standard approach in skills utilization, where we look at skills demand from 4 main variables. Basically, its degree, industry experience, initial training, and frequent learning and development activities in their job. So basically, this is the list of variables that's always been used and associated with high skills demand. Is this perfect? I would say no. You know, it's like, I personally am not really happy with the requirement of a university degree, for instance. But this is balanced out by the other indicators, such as frequent learning and development, industry experience. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is related to the first question. You know, among the companies interviewed, are there differences in size, SME versus MNC, that affect the levels of skill demand and discretion? So are there other variables at work that might also affect the 2x2 framework? Yeah.
So this is a very interesting, how do I put it? What are the limits of surveys, yeah? Because when we collected the question, somebody forgot, or rather did not, because it was establishment, they didn't ask about the firm size, the overall firm size. So we didn't have that data for that particular survey, but we will collect that for the next survey. So we know that, for instance, MNCs tend to be type 1, but it's not really related to size because, or yet we don't know whether is it related to size, because MNCs by definition just means you have operations in more than one country, because we didn't ask for it. But we do know that SMEs are in the type 4. Statistically significant. Doesn't mean that type 2 and type 3 don't have MNCs and SMEs. It's just that it's most likely that you'll find an SME in type 4, an MNC in type 1. Bearing in mind that MNC here does not mean large firms. It just means more than one, operations in more than one country.
Yeah, so as I suggest, let the data speak for itself. I think there's a lot of disagreements around this. Yeah, let the data speak for it. And next question is, I think Jennifer, she asked this, you know, are there hybrid organizations emerging from the research? So you can't put organization into one particular type, but it's kind of a hybrid types. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I kind of answered Jen that there's actually people moving across, you know, like whether is it from type 1 to type 2. We've not found type the other way around, like type 1 from type 3 to type 1, not yet. Shows how strong the boundary strength is, right? But from the type 3 to type 4 and type 1 to type 2, yeah, it's much more fluid than we thought it would be, you know. But again, this is something we need to study in terms of what do you call that? Longitudinally, because only when you've actually studied longitudinally, then you can really state that that has happened. So we have found companies in type 4 and type 2 trying to shift to type 1 and type 3, but we have not found that they have succeeded, obviously, because, you know, this is just the second point of data collection. If we do third and fourth one, we might see changes.
Yeah. A related question is from Lash. He asked, when people leave type 1 company, do they move to other type of companies? If that happens, why do people move from one type to another? So
yeah, so Lash is basically giving me ideas that I need to do another research study, because obviously I only ask the people there. I don't really ask where they go to, right? But so that's really something to be done in a follow-up study. Do they actually move to a different type of organization? But we did find that those who are used to a kind of high levels of discretion, it's very hard for them to shift to very structured environments. So they are likely to choose similar employers, I would hypothesize. But again, short of us collecting data, we probably have to say we don't know.
Yeah, because your framework is on about a framework for corporate structure. So what people do is is out of their agency, and this might come to a different kind of taxonomy. For example, the Jennifer one on the learning persona, right? It's a different perspective altogether, I guess. Yeah. Okay, I think Sunja has another question. You mentioned Agritech as the type 1 company, right? So I think it's a question related to, is it because of still about the sectorial differences?
Yeah. So this was basically a chemical, I would actually say it's manufacturing company moving into agritech. So it is primarily, if it's classified under SSIC, it will be classified as a manufacturing company. So so it is basically looking at pivoting to digital, large MNC. So yeah, no. So I don't observe what Sunju was saying. It was really quite the other way around. Like what the tech operations they are trying to run being being wanting to do it at the international level was no different from what we have seen in other tech companies. So it's basically really creating an arm of technology that to support the main farming business, so to speak. Really interesting company. We're trying to see if some of them can say yes to being publicly identified. If they do, you know, Jennifer, you might want to talk to them.
Okay.
No, we would, Sahara, the research that you're doing is extremely valuable. And in fact, I would very much like to invite you to come share parts of those information with our colleagues and our leaders, you know, because it's very important to challenge thought. It's important that it's provocative in nature and it sparks reflection. It may not necessarily always hold true, but as social scientists, I think in wherever we are placed, in whichever role we hold, that's our beacon call, right? That's we are torchbearers for fundamentally bringing to light some latent assumptions that we hold so that we can, as humankind and as a civilization, wherever we are placed, forge ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
Thank you, Ben. I love the opportunity.
Sorry, yeah. Okay. Yeah, stimulate us to really probe into understanding work practices of corporations when they come into digital transformation. Yeah, so I should start to pose questions to Jennifer. Okay, Jennifer, I think how to encourage, more importantly, teach managers to give autonomy when I observe that many companies in SG are still very rooted in strict hierarchy. So that's a question for you, Jennifer.
Well, one thing that we're trying to do is, it's a very important question. And line managers, we have found in our other pieces of research to have a very direct impact and influence on employees or team members' persona, dominance in where they are. For example, we have employees who come in and then say, I really want to take this holistic course. So we have also a range of courses from technical to transversal skills like collaboration, critical thinking, to very holistic development like rowing and, rock climbing and so on. So often we do hear colleagues saying, I'm new, maybe they feel a sense of pressure that they should take technical domain, functional type practice, technical courses rather than holistic development, maybe later, let me sense the ground first. But I think managers then, direct managers, line managers make a significant difference. So rather than teach, though, I would say, as you can see in our presentation, we take a stance of design, and we design learning engagements in different ways to target and attract and empower, if you will, different managers at different level of readiness. Right. So what we do is we call this learning organization. My head of learning and development, Ivy, mentions this. This is not an initiative. This is a movement. And in movement, we have to bring people along. So what we're running right now as part of OCBC Campus and Designing and Running is a series of capability building through a very inquiry-based action learning approach, where we share very systematically what does our LO framework looks like, what are our lever points, how important the manager role is. And earlier, I only shared with you the framework and our levers and some examples of programs. Our conversations and our dialogue with the individual business units and the individual levels of, depending on their level of readiness, we create a community of learning champions within the bank. We leverage on our campus stars who, as I mentioned, are discretionary, they apply discretionary effort to give back and teach others within the bank. We grow our community through a series of dialogues, engagement sessions, and help them to reflect, help them to become aware, help them to reflect, and then to goal set. So rather than a top-down program and changing structure very directly and intensely face forward, what we try to do is organic change on the ground through a series of very systematic engagements, dialogue sessions, but with very clear artifacts, resources, and setup of communities of practice in order to empower people. Yeah. So we use a range of that because culture and mindsets are shifted by being enrolled in the practice. And that's what we try to do at campus with our managers across the bank.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So let me interpose with a question of my own. So you have a good example of OCBC as a transformative learning organization. To be a learning organization, it has to be intentional. So besides the will, you need the capacity. So can other organizations, for example, smaller organizations like SME, can they be learning organizations? As we know, SME, they face their own set of constraints. They do not benefit from scale. So what can carry across to other organizations, a broad range of organizations, besides those that are huge and have the advantages of scale? Yeah. So Jennifer, your thoughts on that? Yeah.
I personally believe that's why we worked very hard at OCBC campus, and it's an iterative journey. We don't stop on this journey. As you're doing things that are important, you never rush, but you never rest. So to Sunju's question earlier, how long did the bank take to develop the holistic organizational development plan? And I take it that Sunju, you're referring to the learning organization model that I shared earlier. We are still on that journey. But coming to this point, developing a blueprint, developing a clear statement of intent, impact statement, a framework that is very clear, drawing out what are our learning philosophy underpinnings, like our pillars, being autonomy, mastery, relatedness, how that is translated then into a set of design concepts. All right, that I didn't share today. We have 10 design concepts, 4 that are programming oriented and learning programs oriented, and 6 that are spatial oriented. And then translating that into a set of, as you could see, actions, opportunities and actions that the bank can take forward, and different people within the bank can take forward depending on their role, right, and their readiness. What we've tried to arrive at is the 2 levers of, change is being opportunity and motivation, and the pillars of intrinsic motivation, and within there, how you design action steps forward. I believe that this is a framework that is flexible enough to be taken and clear enough to be taken by different organizations, different leaders, different line managers, depending on what roles they're playing to effect change within their own organization, big or small.
Okay, so so you're saying what you share as the ingredients of learning organization could be uptake by other organizations. So at smaller firms like SMEs, they are fighting on the bottom line. They have less time for employees to upskill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. One of my key points earlier as well, in response to Sahara sharing, is you can see if, almost departments within sections within, we have a 5-tier kind of organizational structure, right? Some departments have 3 tiers of sections and units within them. So if you think about department, division within a division, within, like I mentioned earlier, we have 18 divisions within the bank, and the bank, it's not only limited to Singapore, but has a regional and global presence, right? In China, in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia. These are very different cultures, and every different entity, subsidiary, has a different kind of setup, different time, different resources, different pressures of bottom line, different commercial sort of pressures, right? And so if you see an SME as one of these smaller units within the larger bank and the larger group, we try to design our learning organization framework to be able to be taken up by every individual and every individual team and unit. And we invite, we're very keen to find if there are SME colleagues here or researchers, Sahara, like yourself, together with SSG, who wants to conduct a large scale looking at how our learning organization framework might be applicable across our sector for productive collaboration. We're very keen to support that as well. And that tests our own thinking. It will help us to refine the way we forge ahead. And we very much welcome that cognitive diversity.
Fantastic.
A related question for you, Jennifer, is from Vili from NYP. How do OCBC get employees to take responsibility, to take charge of their own learning? Yeah, maybe you'd like to elaborate a bit more on this. Yeah.
There are, as I shared earlier, there are different personas, right? Learning personas, if you will, or learner personas. We also found through our research that learning mindsets and goals are quite different. And if you look at earlier, I mentioned one of the tensions is how do you have efficiency versus effectiveness for the individual, right? We try to hold that as our guiding frame, that in every individual is different. Therefore, it cannot be a design of another program to, that is a one size fit all. It cannot be another, whether it's a program, a playlist, a community, a recommendation, a compulsory mandated learning. There are many variations or modalities. It is, we are unable to, our firm take is that we therefore there's a limit to standardization and top-down push. What we're talking about is we flip the lens, right, to autonomy. So autonomy and developing autonomy, I think here, we look at autonomy as a sense of, or intrinsic motivation as comprising moral autonomy, emotional autonomy, and intellectual autonomy. Autonomous means basically self-rule and self-regulation. So how do we design to that? Our approach is very similar. Our approach engages primarily the design of reflection, awareness. We create awareness. After awareness, we create reflection, okay, opportunities for personal reflection and personal goal setting. This cuts through across, you see behind me in my banner, our Future Smart program, which we have just launched our Future Smart Learning Festival yesterday, similar to, I think, the Singapore Learning Festival, SSG Learning Festival as well. And this cuts across our program. We implement this, we hold this design principle within our programs. But apart from programs, we have our programs are also deeply embedded with action learning components as well, wherever possible. And then we have opportunities for, I mentioned earlier, enrolling as a campus star, teaching others, right? And a lot of this is also, we have this phrase, how do we design for learning, business in learning and learning in business. So every day and every workplace, right? Every work opportunity, every interaction, every team-based meeting, every problem solving is in fact a learning opportunity. How do we then empower the learner and our managers to say, make use of and every of these engagements and meetings as a teachable moment? How do you infuse reflection and goal setting in this so that people are having a growth mindset towards, improving themselves all the time? So later on, I think in a response to another question, I'll talk about learning agility a little bit more as well.
Yeah, indeed. As you said, culture, right, is a new paycheck. It's about building a new learning culture. Yeah, this question on learning agility, you'd like to respond to that?
Yes, I think there was a question from Sunju on whether we profile all our staff members. I think if you were referring, Sunju, to the persona or the 8 archetypal learner personas that we have drawn out, we do not use that as a profiling tool. Rather, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a porous nature to it, and it's very in situ and situational, right? And we are also very mindful of the culture that we want to bring. And that particular persona type has normative values attached to it. Nobody would like to be, definitively identified as a reluctant or disengaged, person, right? Everyone wants to be in the top right-hand corner. So that is more an organizing frame and an understanding frame that through grounded methodology, we actually drew out and emerged these analytic categories. What we do profile, or what we are currently in the midst, we are not completely there yet, is we are designing and availing a learning agility profiler tool. In fact, this is a research in collaboration with the Learning Enterprise Alliance at IAL with Wing On's team, where we are looking at our innovation is to how do we develop a profiling tool that is developmental and formative in nature, that is also motivational in nature, right? And learning agility is very widely used. It's also one of the critical core skills in our new SSG framework. However, we draw from these overarching frameworks, but we define at OCBC learning agility to very much be, do you know what to do when you don't know what to do, right? This is a classic Piagetian look at intelligence, right? Do you know what to do when you don't know what to do? And we unpack our construct of learning agility into 3 dimensions. The first is a growth mindset, all right? Knowing that your intelligence is not fixed, your ability is not fixed, that effort attribution is extremely important. Second is productive failure mindset. Productive failure mindset is a work by a postdoctoral of Carroll that pushes productive failure, as a high correlation to growth mindset, but your attitudes towards risk-taking and failure. And do you see it as productive or do you see it as counterproductive? So growth mindset, productive failure mindset, as well as learning power. Learning power, we draw from Professor Guy Claxton's work, and learning power has 4 subdimensions: resilience, right? Resourcefulness, reciprocity, knowing how to help seek and help give, all right? And the last, which is, I always forget the last, then I'll call Seat to actually answer on my behalf.
Reflectiveness.
Yeah, that's right. How could I forget reflectiveness? Thank you. Seat is my team member, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this panel. She works very closely with me as part of a bigger OCBC campus group in driving learning organization within OCBC group. And yes, reflectiveness, as I mentioned earlier, is really our primary pillar. How do we design for metacognition engagement, right? How do people become aware of where they stand, of their own assumptions, of their own mindsets? How do we get them to reflect on it and then goal set thereafter?
So I think we run through most of the questions. Here's one more question from Helen Bao from IAL. On the point that individuals in type 1 companies may not necessarily be used to exercising discretionary effort, I wonder if OCBC has experienced this. If yes, how do you go about the required agency and the identity development? Yeah. So I guess it's a question for Jan.
For me?
Yeah, it's adjusted to you.
Oh, type 1. Sahara, you should save me. Here you go. Why don't you take a stab at it first?
Yeah, I mean, this is basically what I was sharing just now, that, although it seems like type 1 companies are so perfect, right? They have a challenge. The challenge is that nobody recognizes them to be different. So when people come in and they get hired, people just assume somebody will tell them what to do. And when they actually say, no, you have to figure things out, it's difficult for some people, because I think the other workplaces in Singapore tend to be very much like, this is the SOP, this is generally what you do, etc. And therefore, discretion is within a kind of like certain confines, but not for this type of companies. And they basically said that, and one of the companies actually asked me, can we do something to support that self-directed initiative for their workforce? So just to share that, that's the biggest challenge that type 1 companies actually face. A pipeline of people who join them that don't know that they are different, and therefore expecting the same kind of structure as in other organizations. I'm not sure what you think.
I absolutely agree. I think, to the question, again, I'm very uncomfortable. I think that's what typology set us out to do, right? Frameworks, typologies, they are a big frame. It's a grand narrative. And as post-structuralists will do, they are, they would tear down these big frames. These big frames are very limited. They are good for, having some clarity in policy making, designing structures. I think they're very, very important. At the same time, how do we go down the nuance and attend to the in situ, kind of developmental stage or season that any individual is at? I think that is really the sweet spot question that we have. Absolutely, I think there are definitely, it is not universal. That was my first point to Sahara earlier. It's not universal. Type 1 is not universal because how can you, is it ever possible that 30,000 employees within one organization is universally type 1? Clearly, there are, even if a company is in type 1, right, looking at 30,000 employees, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely, yeah.
Clarify, yeah. I mean, just, because Jen, you were just sharing a lot more about, being typologies being limited. And perhaps I can share my researcher perspective. It's about being analytical. That's really what typology is. Yes. And therefore, but transversing it into practice, that's where the problem is. And that I completely
absolutely agree. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So and the same. Without a typology, without a framework, I would call upon this very important quote, right? That a good theory is one of the most practical assets that we can appropriate, right? That's why we as social scientists are dedicated to our craft of inquiry. And, analytic generalizations are very, very important. Developing frameworks are very important. Without a framework, without a typology, you can't even start a conversation, right? And typologies, I would say, are there to be challenged. And the richness, I think this is an answer to Helen and to your point. The richness, the use of typologies is not prescriptive. It's not meant to be slavishly templated. That is a tension in Singapore for many people. Just like our one other colleague asked earlier, hierarchy, structure, templating, procedural expertise is one of our, gold stars of any Singaporean, proud Singaporean, okay? We're very good at proceduralization. We're very good at operationalization. Coming up with analytic generalizations that make sense, that can be flexible enough to attend to oncoming pressures and problems that we don't even yet know about. That's the challenge. And I think where I would like to call back to my last slide earlier, one of the ways forward, definitely even within OCBC, we do have definitely employees exercising discretionary effort or being used to exercise discretionary effort because motivational levels, exactly as I showed earlier, differ. How do we go about it? It is a journey, I think, very much of in a multi-prong. It's a multi-prong strategy. Firstly, you need frameworks. You need intentional purpose, impact statements, an approach that's very clear, that can be boiled down to any individual to take and run. However, one of the key points for identity formation and culture change is changing the discourse, changing the discursive practice. All these typologies, research frameworks, data points are all to be used, I think, appropriated wisely for rich conversations and rich discursive change and changes in discourse that changes our thinking and then the way we behave and act. That is why we call learning organization a movement, right? A cultural movement, not an initiative.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer.
That can be strictly templated, if you will.
Yeah. So indeed, I think this webinar has brought about this productive tension. A topology has been proposed from the research, and there are issues raised about what kind of analytic generalization, what kind of utility or framework can it serve. So I think Sahara has his views. There's value in simplicity. I think most importantly of all to me in this webinar is stimulate us to really think about the essence, what is happening in organizations as they go about the digital transformation. We may start with Sahara's framework and may evolve to something else, but at least it start on this help us to start this discourse, what really happens at the organizational level, the corporate structures that stimulate all the different practices that, for example, Jennifer has elaborated, needs to be very contextual and depends on a number of nuances. So, yeah, thanks, Sahara, for initiating us a framework. I think we can continue to discuss this offline after this webinar.
Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you very much for sharing the practices of OCBC as a
transformative
learning organization. And that was really some of the ingredients in it, the practices, some of the topology you use yourself, which is the learning personas at the individual level. Some of the practices like Mentor Me, very specific, addressing addressing a specific segment of the employees. So I think a lot we can learn from in how to go about developing a learning culture. I think it's important because we talk about developing a mindset of workers, right, employees to be flexible, right, to accept change as the normal and to be flexible to adapt to those change. So your response, OCBC response is, to initiate to have this learning culture, right, which not only move the employees forward, but actually is rewarding for them to be in this culture. So thank you for sharing very much these insights. So I hope for the audience, this has been a very stimulating discussion for you. Do not let it stop here. Feel free to approach us, Cradle, or the speakers to continue your conversations about deepening our understanding, how to prepare our workers, our learners for the workforce, the digital transformation, the automation that is about to come. So on this note, I really want to thank our speakers, Sahara Sadik and Jennifer Tan, for taking time off their busy schedule and sharing with us their insights. So thank you very much indeed. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to
so
thank
much.
all the participants for attending this seminar. Sarah, Jennifer, any last word with our audience? Maybe give you some airtime.
Sahara, please.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Really, this is basically a start of how we are trying to look at the future from the current. Really, right? We always talk about the future, but the future is being shaped today. So and therefore look at how current practices will help us, and what are the existing practices that we may need to shift if we really want to get to the future that we want. So a kind of like an approach that, and I hope everyone will join us in this journey through the Digital Futures Research Program on the website that I shared earlier.
Thank you, Sahara. Dr. Jennifer Tan.
Learning, I think, is a learning, and the learning enterprise that we are all a part of is a fraught and complex endeavor. But there's nothing more compelling, I feel. Learning is really very powerful and one of the most compelling endeavors. This is an open invite to all participants, scientists, academia, industry, policymakers alike. Reach out to us at OCBC Bank, jentan@ocbc.com. We are more than happy, and we really invite you to journey along with us in designing and building a transformative learning organization culture, not only for our organization, but for our society at large. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Learning for all of us. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll end this webinar. Thank you for your time, participants attending, and have a nice weekend. Yeah.
Thank you.